Humiliation prickled Emma's skin. 1 hour, 5 crumpled dollars in her purse, a chasm between her and the cheapest appetizer on Fontaine's menu. Across the room, a man watched, his gaze unsettlingly kind. Sentiment, a sneering voice cut through the opulent air, will keep you small time. But the man watching knew a different kind of wealth. The gentle clink of fine china and crystal. Emma clutched her small purse tighter, feeling the weight of the 5 crumpled dollar bills inside her entire food budget for the week. She had tried to cancel this blind date 3 times, but her best friend Sarah had been so insistent, so excited about setting her up with the perfect guy, that Emma hadn't had the heart to explain her financial situation. Working 2 part-time jobs while finishing her teaching degree left Emma with barely enough to cover rent and textbooks. The elegant cream sweater she wore had been her mother's, carefully preserved and only brought out for special occasions. Her simple black pants came from a consignment shop, but she hoped the combination looked appropriate for a place like this. "Reservation?" asked the mat for D, his tone polite but assessing. "Walsh party of 2, Emma replied, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. She was led to a small table near the window, where she sat nervously checking her phone for any message from her date. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Emma's cheeks burned with embarrassment as she realized other diners were beginning to notice the young woman sitting alone, occasionally glancing toward the door with decreasing hope. At a table across the dining room, 36-year-old Daniel Hartwell was having his own difficult evening. As CEO of Hartwell Industries, he was accustomed to business dinners, but tonight's meeting with a potential investor had taken an unexpectedly confrontational turn. The man across from him, Richard Blackstone, had spent the last hour questioning not just Daniel's business decisions, but his priorities as a single father. "You can't build an empire while playing daddy," Blackstone was saying, cutting into his expensive steak. "Successful men make hard choices. That's what separates us from the mediocre." Daniel's jaw tightened. "My daughter is not a distraction from my success. She's the reason for it. Sentiment like that will keep you small time," Blackstone replied dismissively. "Mark my words, Hartwell. You'll never reach your full potential while you're changing diapers and attending school plays." As this conversation continued, Daniel found his attention drawn to the young woman at the table near the window. He had noticed her when she first arrived, not because she was strikingly beautiful, though she was, but because of the careful way she had smoothed her sweater and checked her reflection in the window. The nervous energy that suggested this evening meant something important to her. Now, 45 minutes later, she was still sitting alone. Daniel watched as she declined the waiter's offers of appetizers and wine, asking only for water. There was something dignified about the way she held herself despite what was obviously an embarrassing situation. "Are you even listening to me?" Blackstone demanded, noticing Daniel's distraction. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, turning back to his companion. "You were saying something about priorities." Emma checked her phone again. An hour had passed since their agreed meeting time, and her date had sent no word of explanation or apology. The waiter approached her table for the 4th time, his professional smile beginning to show strain. "Miss, are you certain you wouldn't like to order something while you wait? Perhaps an appetizer?" Emma glanced at the menu she had been avoiding looking at all evening. The cheapest appetizer cost $12, more than twice what she had brought. "Just water, please. I'm sure he'll be here soon." But as another 15 minutes passed, Emma had to face the truth. She had been stood up. The humiliation was almost unbearable, made worse by the fact that she was sitting in a restaurant where she couldn't afford to buy so much as a dinner roll. She stood to leave, gathering her purse and trying to maintain whatever dignity she had left. As she turned toward the door, she nearly collided with their waiter, who was carrying a covered plate. "Miss Walsh, your dinner," he said with a warm smile. Emma stared at him in confusion. "I'm sorry, there's been a mistake. I didn't order anything. The gentleman at table 12 has taken care of everything," the waiter explained, gesturing discreetly toward Daniel's table. "He asked me to tell you that beautiful women should never have to eat alone." Emma followed his gesture and found herself looking into the kindest brown eyes she had ever seen. Daniel Hartwell was perhaps 10 years older than her, with dark hair touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and a face that spoke of both success and genuine warmth. He was seated with an older man who looked thoroughly displeased by whatever conversation they were having. Daniel raised his glass slightly in her direction, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Emma felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "I can't accept this," she said quietly to the waiter. "I don't even know him." "He anticipated you might say that," the waiter replied with practiced discretion. "He asked me to tell you that acts of kindness should never be refused, especially when they're offered freely and without expectation." The covered plate revealed a beautifully prepared salmon with roasted vegetables, elegant, but not ostentatiously expensive. Emma looked across the room again and saw that Daniel was no longer paying attention to his dinner companion, but was watching her with gentle encouragement. For a moment, Emma considered walking out anyway. Her pride demanded it, but her empty stomach and the genuine kindness in the gesture made her reconsider. She had worked a double shift yesterday and hadn't eaten since breakfast. More than that, there was something in Daniel's expression that suggested his generosity came from understanding, not pity. She sat back down and nodded gratefully in Daniel's direction. He smiled and returned to his conversation, giving her the privacy to eat without feeling observed. The food was extraordinary, but Emma barely tasted it. She was too aware of the man across the room who had saved her from complete humiliation, too puzzled by his motivation, too curious about what kind of person performed such acts of spontaneous kindness. As she ate, she couldn't help but overhear pieces of the conversation at Daniel's table. The older man's voice was getting louder and more aggressive. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Hartwell. Throwing money at strangers, getting distracted by every soba story that crosses your path. How do you expect to focus on building an empire when you're busy playing Good Samaritan?" "Maybe because I don't want to build the kind of empire that requires me to ignore human decency," Daniel replied, his voice calm but firm. "Decency doesn't pay dividends," Blackstone snapped, "and it certainly doesn't impress investors." "Then perhaps you're not the right investor for my company," Daniel said quietly. Emma watched as Blackstone's face turned red with anger. "You're making a mistake, Hartwell. I could have made you very wealthy." "I'm already wealthy in the ways that matter," Daniel replied. "I have a daughter who respects me, employees who trust me, and the ability to sleep well at night knowing I haven't compromised my values for profit." Blackstone threw his napkin on the table and stood up abruptly. "You'll regret this decision. When you're struggling to expand, when you're watching your competitors pass you by, remember this conversation." "I will," Daniel said calmly, "and I'll be grateful I chose integrity over your investment." After Blackstone stormed out, Daniel sat quietly for a moment, processing the evening's events. His business manager would probably tell him he had made a terrible mistake. The expansion plans would have to be postponed, and finding another investor of Blackstone's caliber would be difficult. But as he looked across the room at Emma, who was eating her dinner with obvious gratitude, he felt a sense of peace about his decision. There were more important things than business deals, and tonight had reminded him of what those things were. Emma finished her meal and asked the waiter for the check, intending to at least cover the cost of her water. To her surprise, he informed her that everything had been taken care of, including a generous tip. She looked across the room to thank her mysterious benefactor, but found him gathering his things to leave. Impulsively, she stood and approached his table. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I wanted to thank you for dinner. That was incredibly kind." Up close, Daniel was even more striking. There was something solid and trustworthy about him, but also a sadness around his eyes that spoke of losses Emma could only imagine. "It was my pleasure," he said, standing politely. "I hope your evening improved." "It did, thanks to you," Emma replied, "but I have to ask why. You don't know me, and what you just did was incredibly generous." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. 2 years ago, I was having dinner with my 7-year-old daughter at a family restaurant. A woman at the next table was crying because her card was declined and she couldn't pay for her children's meals. My daughter asked me why I didn't help her. He paused, his expression growing distant. I gave my daughter some money to give to the woman, and afterwards she asked me if that's what daddies are supposed to do, help people when they need it. I told her, yes, that's exactly what we're supposed to do. Emma felt tears prick her eyes at the simple beauty of the story. Tonight, when I saw you waiting alone, and then noticed you couldn't afford to order, I heard my daughter's voice asking me what I was going to do about it. Daniel continued. The answer was obvious. Your daughter sounds like a remarkable little girl, Emma said. She is. She's taught me that success means nothing if it doesn't make you a better person. Daniel smiled woefully. Just cost me a major investment deal, actually. Emma had overheard enough of his conversation to understand. The man who was with you seemed awful. He was, and walking away from his offer was the best decision I've made in months. Daniel extended his hand. I'm Daniel Hartwell, by the way. Emma Walsh, she replied, shaking his hand and feeling a spark of connection she hadn't expected. And I'm going to pay you back for dinner. Absolutely not, Daniel said firmly. But I'll make you a deal. Emma raised an eyebrow curiously. Let me take you to dinner properly, sometime somewhere. We can actually have a conversation without business associates ruining the evening. Emma's heart skipped. Mr. Hartwell, you don't need to feel obligated. Daniel, he corrected, and it's not obligation, it's interest. I'd like to get to know the woman who sat through an hour of being stood up with such grace and dignity. Emma looked into his eyes and saw sincerity there, along with something that looked like hope. I'd like that, she heard herself say. As they walked out of Fontaine's together, Emma couldn't help but marvel at how the evening had unfolded. She had come expecting to meet someone her friend thought would be perfect for her, and instead had encountered someone who was perfect in ways she never could have imagined. 6 months later, Emma would be sitting in Daniel's kitchen, helping his daughter Sophie with her homework while he prepared dinner. The little girl who had inspired her father's kindness had become Emma's biggest champion, delighted to finally have someone who could braid hair and help with art projects. The teaching degree Emma had been struggling to afford was completed with help from a scholarship program Daniel had quietly established, not just for her, but for other students facing similar financial challenges. And Daniel had found something he hadn't been looking for, a partner who valued kindness over wealth, who saw his role as a father not as a limitation, but as proof of his capacity for love, and who understood that the best investments aren't always measured in dollars and cents. The restaurant where they had first met became their anniversary tradition. Every year they would return to table 12 and Daniel would tell Sophie the story of how a 1-5 blind date had led to the greatest fortune of his life. A family built on love, generosity, and the understanding that true wealth comes from lifting others up. Sometimes the most meaningful connections begin with the simplest acts of kindness. A stranger's dinner, freely given, can become the foundation for a lifetime of love. And sometimes the person we're meant to find isn't the one we're waiting for, but the one who's watching from across the room, ready to show us that there are still people in the world who believe in doing good for its own sake. If this story reminded you that kindness is always the right choice and that love often finds us when we least expect it, please give it a like and share it with someone who could use a reminder that good people still exist. Subscribe for more stories about unexpected connections and the beautiful ways that generosity comes back to us. And please comment below about a time when a stranger's kindness changed your day or your perspective. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear.